My name is Amina Khalil. I am 34 years old, and on September 12, 2019, I died for 12 minutes after being shot during a marketplace attack in Aleppo, Syria. I was a devout Muslim widow and mother of two young children, having lost my husband in the 2016 conflict. What I experienced in those 12 minutes changed everything I believed about Allah, paradise, and who Jesus really is. I was born in 1985 in the ancient city of Aleppo, Syria, into a traditional Sunni Muslim family where faith was not just a set of beliefs, but the foundation that shaped every aspect of our daily lives. My parents raised me with deep reverence for Allah, strict adherence to Islamic law, and unwavering commitment to the 5 daily prayers that marked the rhythm of each day. From my earliest memories, the call to prayer echoing from the nearby mosque was as natural and essential as breathing, and I learned to find peace and purpose in the structured devotion that Islam provided. When I turned 22 in 2007, I married Omar Khalil, a man who shared my deep commitment to Islamic faith and practice. Omar was a respected teacher of Islamic studies at one of Aleppo's religious schools, known throughout our community for his knowledge of the Quran and his gentle way of explaining complex theological concepts to his students. Our marriage was built on shared values, mutual respect, and a common dream of raising children who would grow up with strong Islamic identity and unwavering faith in Allah. The early years of our marriage were filled with happiness and hope. Omar and I would spend evenings reading the Quran together, discussing the meaning of various passages, and planning for the family we hoped to have. He would often tell me stories of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, bringing the history of Islam to life with his passionate storytelling and deep understanding of our religious heritage. I felt blessed to be married to a man who could guide our family's spiritual growth and help our future children develop the same love for Allah that sustained us both. In 2013, our first child Yasmin was born, followed 2 years later by our son Hassan. Watching Omar with our children filled my heart with joy and gratitude to Allah for blessing us with such a beautiful family. He would teach them simple prayers in Arabic, tell them stories from Islamic history, and demonstrate through his own example what it meant to live as a faithful Muslim. Our home was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, mixed with the melodic recitation of Quranic verses that Omar would practice for his teaching. But in 2016, when Yasmin was 6 and Hassan was 4, our peaceful world was shattered by the violence that had been consuming Syria for years. Omar was walking home from the mosque after evening prayers when he was caught in crossfire between opposing forces, fighting for control of our neighborhood. A stray bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly and leaving me a widow at the age of 31, with two young children who could barely understand why their father would never come home again. The grief that followed Omar's death was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt as though half of my soul had been torn away, leaving me hollow and struggling to function even in the most basic ways. I would wake up each morning expecting to see him beside me, and the realization that he was gone would hit me fresh each day like a physical blow. Yasmin kept asking when Papa was coming home, and Hassan would cry for his father at bedtime, not understanding why the man who used to tell him stories and teach him prayers had simply vanished. Have you ever felt completely alone, even when surrounded by people who care about you? That's exactly where I found myself during those first months after losing Omar. Despite the support of extended family and our mosque community, I felt spiritually and emotionally isolated in ways that seemed impossible to bridge. The practical challenges of raising two children alone while dealing with my own overwhelming grief made each day feel like an insurmountable mountain to climb. In my desperation for comfort and hope, I threw myself into Islamic devotion with an intensity that surprised even those who had known me as a religious person throughout my life. I began spending hours each day in prayer and meditation, memorizing long passages from the Quran, and studying Islamic teachings about death, paradise, and the promise of reunion with loved ones in the afterlife. The mosque became my refuge, and the structured routine of Islamic observance became the framework that held my shattered life together. I started wearing full hijab and encouraging other women in our community to deepen their own Islamic practice, believing that increased devotion would somehow bring me closer to Omar's soul and ensure our reunion in Jannah. I taught Yasmin and Hassan to memorize Quranic verses and Islamic prayers, telling them that their father was waiting for us in paradise and that faithful observance of Islamic law would guarantee that our family would be together again in the afterlife. Yet, despite my outward piety and increased religious activity, I began to notice a growing sense of spiritual emptiness that seemed to deepen rather than diminish as time passed. The prayers that had once brought me peace now felt mechanical and routine. The Quranic verses that had once filled me with comfort now seemed distant and abstract. I found myself going through the motions of Islamic devotion while feeling increasingly disconnected from the God I was trying so desperately to please. The financial struggles that came with being a single mother added another layer of stress to our daily lives. Omar's modest salary as a religious teacher had been sufficient for our family when he was alive, but now I had to find ways to support myself and the children with very limited skills and opportunities. I began working as a seamstress, taking in clothing repairs and alterations that I could do from our small apartment while still being present for Yasmin and Hassan. Our neighborhood had been damaged during the years of conflict, and many of our friends and neighbors had fled the country or moved to safer areas within Syria. The community that had once provided support and friendship was scattered, leaving us increasingly isolated in a city that bore the scars of war on every street corner. Yet I was determined to stay in Aleppo, partly because I could not afford to relocate, but mostly because this was where Omar and I had built our life together, and leaving felt like abandoning the memories we had created. During the quiet hours after the children were asleep, I would often find myself questioning why Allah had allowed such tragedy to destroy our happy family. Omar had been a righteous man who dedicated his life to teaching Islamic faith, and our children were innocent of any wrongdoing. Why would a merciful God permit such suffering to fall upon a family that had tried faithfully to serve Him? I would quickly suppress these doubts, telling myself that questioning Allah's will was a sign of weak faith, but the questions continued to surface despite my efforts to silence them. By 2019, 3 years after Omar's death, I had maintained the appearance of strong faith and had become known in our community as an example of how a Muslim woman should handle widowhood with dignity and continued devotion to Allah. Other women would come to me for advice about prayer, religious observance, and finding comfort in Islamic teaching during difficult times. I fulfilled this role as best I could, sharing verses from the Quran and encouraging them to trust in Allah's wisdom, even as my own heart felt increasingly empty. The children had adapted to life without their father better than I had expected, but I could see the effects of growing up in a war-torn city and living with a mother who struggled with depression despite her religious devotion. Yasmin, now 9, had become serious and responsible beyond her years, often helping me care for Hassan and manage household tasks. Hassan, at 7, still occasionally asked when Papa was coming home, and I would remind him that we would see his father again in paradise if we lived as faithful Muslims. What I didn't realize was that my increased religious activity and strict adherence to Islamic law were actually symptoms of spiritual desperation rather than genuine faith. I was trying to earn God's favor and guarantee my family's eternal reunion through good works and religious performance, never understanding that my efforts were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how God's love actually works. September 12th, 2019 began like any other Thursday in our small apartment in the Al Shar neighborhood of Aleppo. I woke before dawn to perform my Fajr prayers, as I had done faithfully every morning since Omar's death 3 years earlier. The children were still sleeping peacefully in their shared bedroom, and I cherished these quiet moments before the day's responsibilities began. After finishing my prayers and reciting verses from the Quran that brought me comfort, I prepared a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and tea for our family. Yasmin, now 9 years old, had developed the serious demeanor of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. She helped me wake Hassan and get him dressed for the day, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults rather than a little girl. Hassan, at 7, still carried the innocent cheerfulness that had reminded me so much of his father, though I could see the effects of growing up without Omar's gentle guidance and protection. That morning, I had planned to take the children to visit my mother in law, Omar's mother, who lived on the other side of the city near the ancient citadel. She had been struggling with her own grief since losing her son, and these weekly visits had become important for all of us. The children loved spending time with their grandmother, who would tell them stories about their father's childhood and help them maintain connection to the man they were slowly forgetting. Before heading to grandmother's house, we needed to stop at Al Madina marketplace to buy vegetables and bread for the week. My seamstress work provided just enough income to cover our basic needs, but I had to be careful with every pound we spent. The marketplace was one of the few places in our neighborhood where normal life continued despite the ongoing conflict, and I always felt a sense of gratitude for these small pockets of normalcy that remained in our war-torn city. The September weather was beautiful that day, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that made walking through the city pleasant, rather than the ordeal it could be during the harsh summer months. Yasmin walked beside me, carrying a small bag for our purchases, while Hassan skipped ahead, excited about seeing his grandmother and the treats she always had waiting for him. For a few moments, I felt something approaching happiness as I watched my children enjoy this simple outing. Al Madina marketplace was busy with the usual afternoon crowd of shoppers, vendors calling out their prices, and the general bustle of commerce that had continued even through the worst years of Syria's conflict. I felt safe there, surrounded by familiar faces and the routine activities that connected us to life before the war. The vegetable vendor knew us by name and always set aside the best produce for widows and families struggling financially. The baker would sometimes slip extra bread into our bag when he thought no one was looking. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, as I was selecting tomatoes and onions for the week's meals, the peaceful atmosphere of the marketplace was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire erupting near the main entrance. The shots came without warning, transforming the busy market from a place of normal life into a scene of absolute terror within seconds. People began screaming and running in every direction, knocking over vendor stalls and trampling merchandise in their desperate attempts to escape. I immediately grabbed both children, pulling them close to my body while trying to assess where the gunfire was coming from and which direction might offer safety. My heart was pounding with the familiar fear that every Syrian civilian had learned to live with, but now it was amplified by my responsibility to protect Yasmin and Hassan. In that moment of chaos and terror, my greatest fear was not dying myself, but leaving my children orphaned with no one to care for them. The shooting seemed to be coming from multiple directions, suggesting that this was not a targeted attack, but rather random violence that had erupted in the market for reasons we would probably never understand. I could see muzzle flashes from at least 2 different positions, and the sound of bullets ricocheting off concrete walls and metal vendor stalls created a deafening cacophony that made it impossible to think clearly. Spotting a concrete vendor stall that sold household goods, I pushed Yasmin and Hassan behind it, pressing them down low and covering their small bodies with my own. Stay down and don't move, I whispered urgently in their ears, trying to keep my voice calm despite the terror I felt. Mama will protect you. Hassan was crying and calling for me, while Yasmin was trying to be brave, but I could feel her trembling beneath me. As I crouched there shielding my children, a single bullet struck me in the upper chest, just below my collarbone. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, spinning me away from the children and sending me crashing to the ground several feet from where they were hiding. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything I had experienced during childbirth or any physical injury I had ever sustained. I could feel warm blood spreading rapidly across the front of my dress, soaking through the fabric and pooling on the dusty ground beneath me. My strength began draining away with shocking speed, and I realized with growing horror that I was dying and would be leaving Yasmin and Hassan alone in this dangerous world. The thought of my children growing up as orphans was more agonizing than the physical pain from the bullet wound. From my position on the ground, I could hear my children calling for me, their voices filled with terror and confusion. Yasmin was crying, Mama, Mama, while Hassan was screaming for help, but the ongoing gunfire made it too dangerous for anyone to come to our aid. I tried to call back to them, to reassure them that I was still alive, but my voice was weak and my lungs were filling with blood that made speaking almost impossible. As my vision began to blur and my breathing became labored, I attempted to recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith that every Muslim hopes to speak as their final words. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. I wanted to die with Allah's name on my lips, trusting that my years of faithful devotion would ensure my entrance into paradise and eventual reunion with Omar. My thoughts turned to my children and what would happen to them after I died. Who would take care of them? Would they remember their father and mother? Would they grow up knowing that they had been loved completely? I prayed desperately that Allah would protect them and provide for their needs, even though I was about to abandon them in this cruel world. The sounds of the marketplace around me began to fade, as if I was hearing them from a great distance. The gunfire continued, but it seemed muted and unimportant. The voices of people calling for help became like echoes from another world. Even my children's cries gradually grew quieter until I could barely hear them at all. My last conscious thought was a prayer directed toward Omar. My beloved husband, I'm coming to join you. Watch over our children until we can all be together again in paradise. I believed that within moments I would be standing before Allah for judgment, and that if I had been faithful enough, I would soon be reunited with the man I had loved and lost 3 years earlier. Then my heart stopped beating, and everything went completely dark. The pain disappeared, the sounds of violence faded into silence, and my consciousness separated from the broken body lying in the blood-soaked dust of Al Madina marketplace. According to the paramedics who arrived several minutes later, I was clinically dead for 12 minutes before my heart spontaneously resumed beating. But what happened during those 12 minutes would change everything I had ever believed about God, death, and eternal life. The next moment of awareness came with the startling realization that I was floating above the scene in the marketplace, looking down at my own motionless body lying in a pool of blood near the concrete vendor stall. From this elevated perspective, I could see everything with perfect clarity. My children huddled behind the stall where I had pushed them for safety, the ongoing chaos as people continued to flee the gunfire, and the paramedics who had just arrived and were beginning to work over my lifeless form. What shocked me most was that I felt completely awake and alert, more conscious than I had ever been during my physical existence. I could see every detail of the scene below me, hear every word being spoken, and understand exactly what was happening, yet I was clearly dead. My body lay motionless on the dusty ground, blood staining my traditional dress, while the paramedics checked for vital signs and found none. I watched as my mother in law arrived at the marketplace, having heard about the shooting from neighbors. When she saw my body and realized that Yasmin and Hassan were now orphaned, her grief was heartbreaking to witness. She fell to her knees beside my corpse, wailing and calling out to Allah, asking why He had taken both her son and her daughter in law, leaving these innocent children with no parents. The paramedics were working frantically, attempting CPR and other resuscitation procedures, but I could see from my position above that their efforts were futile. The bullet had caused massive internal damage, and too much blood had been lost for my body to sustain life. One of them checked his watch and spoke into his radio. Female, approximately 34 years old, gunshot wound to the chest, no pulse, no respiratory activity for approximately 8 minutes. I tried desperately to call out to my children, to let them know that I was somehow still present and aware of their situation, but no sound emerged from whatever form I now possessed. When I attempted to reach down and touch Yasmin's shoulder, to comfort her as she cried for her mama, my hand passed through her as if I was made of nothing more substantial than air. The realization that I could no longer communicate with or comfort my children filled me with anguish, unlike anything I had felt during my physical life. According to everything I had been taught about Islamic theology, this should have been the moment when the angels Munkar and Nakir appeared to question me about my faith and deeds before escorting me to paradise or hell. I had spent my entire life preparing for this examination, memorizing Quranic verses and performing good deeds that I hoped would guarantee my entrance into Jannah. Instead, I found myself suspended in this strange state of consciousness, watching my earthly life end while feeling completely alone. Suddenly, I felt a powerful force beginning to pull me away from the marketplace scene. It was not a physical sensation exactly, but rather like being drawn by an irresistible current that I had no ability to control or resist. The scene of my death began to fade from view as I was transported through what appeared to be a vast tunnel of absolute darkness. The movement accelerated until I was traveling at impossible speed through this tunnel of emptiness. The darkness was so complete that it seemed to swallow not just light, but hope itself. There were no reference points to indicate direction or distance, just endless black voids stretching in every direction I looked. The silence was equally profound, deeper than anything I had ever experienced during the quietest moments of prayer and meditation. As I continued moving through this terrible emptiness, I gradually became aware of sounds in the distance that filled me with growing dread. There were voices, but they were not speaking in celebration or praise as I had expected to hear in paradise. Instead, I heard crying, wailing, and desperate calls that seemed to echo endlessly through the darkness. Some of the voices were speaking in Arabic, and as I listened more carefully, I could make out specific words and phrases that chilled my soul. Allah, Allahu Akbar. Some were crying, but their tone was not one of worship, but of desperate pleading. Other voices were repeating La ilaha illa Allah, the fundamental declaration of Islamic faith, but they sounded like prisoners calling for help rather than believers proclaiming their devotion. I called out to Allah, but there was only silence. Have you ever felt like your prayers weren't being heard? That's exactly what I experienced in that spiritual darkness, but magnified beyond anything I had felt during my earthly struggles. Every prayer I had ever offered, every act of religious devotion I had performed, every moment of faith that had sustained me through 34 years of life seemed meaningless in the face of this overwhelming emptiness. The realization that these were the voices of Muslims who, like me, had expected to find paradise but had instead found themselves in this realm of spiritual darkness shook me to my very core. These were people who had followed Islamic law, performed their prayers, fasted during Ramadan, and lived according to the teachings of the Quran. Yet, they seemed to be trapped in a place of abandonment and despair. I began to recognize the anguish in their cries. These were souls who had believed their good deeds and religious observance would earn them a place in paradise. Yet, they found themselves in this realm of spiritual desolation. Some were calling out the names of family members, others were reciting verses from the Quran, and still others were pleading for mercy and forgiveness from a God who seemed not to hear them. The spiritual oppression in this place was crushing. All the guilt I had carried about not being a perfect Muslim, all the doubts I had suppressed about why Allah had allowed Omar's death and our family's suffering, all the questions I had avoided about the contradictions between Islamic teaching and the reality of life came flooding back with multiplied intensity. I felt completely alone and abandoned, cut off from the God I had served faithfully and from the husband I had expected to reunite with in paradise. The darkness seemed to be pressing in on me from all sides, and I began to fear that this emptiness might be my eternal destination, that I would spend forever floating in this void of spiritual desolation, along with all these other disappointed souls. I tried my own prayers, reciting the verses that had brought me comfort during the darkest days after Omar's death, but they seemed to have no power in this place. The words that had once filled me with strength and hope now felt empty and ineffective, like calling into a void that absorbed sound without echo or response. As my own desperation grew, I began to understand that my religious devotion, my memorization of Quranic verses, and my sincere attempts to live as a faithful Muslim widow had not guaranteed my salvation. If good works and Islamic observance were sufficient for paradise, why was I trapped in this darkness along with so many other believers who had tried to earn God's favor through their deeds? But just as I was beginning to accept this terrible fate as my deserved punishment for some spiritual failure I could not identify, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. A light appeared in the distance, cutting through the absolute darkness like a sword of pure radiance. This was not ordinary light like sunlight or electric illumination. This light was alive, pulsing with energy, love, and holiness that I could feel even from far away. The moment this light appeared, the oppressive spiritual atmosphere that had been crushing me began to lift. The voices of despair around me grew quieter, and I felt a warmth beginning to flow through my soul that was unlike anything I had ever experienced during my earthly existence. As the light drew closer, I heard a voice speaking my name with infinite tenderness and love. Amina, the voice said, and immediately I knew that this voice knew everything about me. Not just my name and my struggles as a widow, but my every thought, every secret doubt, every moment of joy and sorrow that had marked my journey through life. Yet there was no condemnation in that voice, only love and acceptance that overwhelmed my understanding. My beloved daughter, the voice continued, and the love in those words was so pure and overwhelming that I began to weep with a mixture of relief and wonder that such love could exist in the midst of such darkness. As I drew closer to the magnificent light, I began to make out a figure within the radiance that took my breath away completely. It was a man with kind, gentle features and Middle Eastern appearance, similar to people from my own region, wearing robes of the purest white that seemed to glow with inner light. His presence radiated an authority and love that exceeded anything I had encountered during my 34 years of life. Yet, at the same time, he emanated a tenderness that made me feel completely safe and cherished. The moment I saw the scars on his hands and feet, I knew with absolute certainty who was standing before me. This was Jesus Christ, the one Muslims call Isa al-Masih, but I was seeing him in a way that completely shattered every theological framework I had been taught about him. This was not the limited prophet that Islamic teaching had described, nor the figure whose divinity I had been told was a Christian corruption of his true message. This was the most powerful, most loving, most divine being I had ever encountered. "Who are you, my Lord?" I cried out, instinctively covering my face, because His holiness was almost too pure to look upon directly. His voice, when He answered, carried the weight of ultimate truth, yet it was gentle and filled with infinite compassion. "Amina, it is I, Jesus, the one who gave His life for you. But you are only Isa, a prophet of Allah," I protested, my entire worldview reeling from this encounter. "The Quran teaches that you did not die on the cross. Christians have corrupted your message and made you into something you never claimed to be." Jesus looked at me with eyes that held no anger or irritation at my theological confusion, no impatience with my resistance to accepting what I was witnessing. Instead, his gaze conveyed a patience and love so pure that it brought tears to my eyes. "My child, I am more than a prophet," he said with authority that resonated through my very soul. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. What you learned was not the full truth about who I am." The love in his voice was unlike anything I had ever experienced during my years as Omar's wife or as a mother to my children. This was not human love, wonderful as that had been, but something infinitely deeper and more complete. This was perfect love, reaching towards me personally, intimately, with a knowledge of my heart that surpassed anything I had ever imagined possible. "You were not abandoned, Amina," Jesus continued, and suddenly I understood that he knew about every night I had cried myself to sleep after Omar's death, every moment I had wondered if Allah had forgotten me, every time I had felt spiritually empty despite my increased religious devotion. "I have known you since before you were born. I was there when you married Omar, when your children were born, and when you wept beside your husband's grave." Jesus raised his scarred hand, and suddenly scenes from my life began to play out around us like moving pictures suspended in the spiritual realm. I watched myself as a young bride, filled with joy and hope for the future Omar and I would build together. I saw the births of Yasmin and Hassan, moments of pure happiness when our family felt complete and blessed. I witnessed Omar teaching our children their prayers, his gentle voice explaining verses from the Quran with love and patience. But then the scenes shifted to show me moments that were far more difficult to observe. I watched the night Omar was killed, seeing not just my own devastating grief, but also the anguish of my children, who could not understand why their father had suddenly vanished from their lives. I saw my own attempts to find comfort in increased religious devotion, and I realized with painful clarity that I had been trying to earn God's favor rather than receiving His love. Most painfully, I saw instances when I had felt spiritually superior to other Muslim women who seemed less devout than myself, when I had judged neighbors for not praying as often as I did, and when I had harbored resentment toward God for allowing my family to suffer while other families remained intact. I had maintained an appearance of faithful submission to Allah's will while secretly questioning His justice and love. "I see it now," I whispered, my heart breaking with recognition of how my grief had mixed with spiritual pride and hidden anger. I thought my increased prayers and religious observance would force Allah to bless me and reunite me with Omar in paradise. I was trying to earn something that cannot be earned. Jesus nodded with understanding that held no condemnation, only infinite patience with my spiritual blindness. "You served the God you knew, Amina, but there was more to know about His heart. I do not seek rituals from you. I seek your heart. I do not demand religious performance from you. I offer you relationship with the Father who loves you unconditionally." He gestured, and suddenly I saw visions that completely revolutionized my understanding of God's plan for humanity. I watched Jesus hanging on a cross, but now I comprehended that this was not the failed mission of a defeated prophet as I had been taught. This was the Son of God voluntarily taking upon himself the punishment that my sins and the sins of all humanity deserved. The crucifixion was not a tragic mistake, but the ultimate expression of divine love. I gave my life for you, Amina, Jesus said as the vision continued. Every moment of agony I endured on that cross was because I love you personally. I took your grief, your anger, your spiritual failures, your attempts to earn salvation through good works, and I paid the price for all of it so that you could be forgiven and have eternal life with me. The weight of this revelation brought me to my knees before him. I had spent years since Omar's death trying to ensure my entrance into paradise through religious devotion and good deeds, never understanding that the price for my eternal life had already been paid by someone else. The grace being offered to me was completely undeserved and impossible to earn, yet it was being freely given out of pure love. Then I saw the empty tomb. The resurrection that I had been taught was a Christian fabrication invented to support false doctrine about Jesus' divinity. But now I understood that death could not hold the Son of God, because love is stronger than death, life is more powerful than destruction, and truth will always triumph over human misunderstanding and theological limitations. Jesus stepped closer and placed his scarred hand on my shoulder. The touch sent waves of love, acceptance, and peace through my entire being. It was as if every burden I had carried since Omar's death, every question about why God had allowed such tragedy, every fear about my children's future, was being lifted from my shoulders and dissolved in the light of perfect love. Now ask yourself this, Jesus said, and suddenly I found myself addressing you who are hearing my story. Are you following a religion, or are you following the truth himself? Are you trying to earn God's love through good deeds and religious observance, or do you understand that his love is freely given to anyone who receives it? Jesus gestured around us, and I saw a realm of indescribable beauty that made earthly paradise seem like a pale shadow by comparison. But what amazed me most was not the magnificent landscape, but the people I saw there. There were souls from every nation, race, and religious background, united in perfect love and harmony. I saw former Muslims who had discovered Jesus' true identity, Christians who had lived their entire lives knowing him, and people from backgrounds I could not even identify, all worshipping together in perfect unity. This is not just your destination, Amina, Jesus said, with joy that filled the entire spiritual realm around us. This is what I desire for your children, for every Muslim woman struggling with grief and doubt, for every person who has been trying to earn salvation through religious performance. My love is big enough for everyone, and my arms are open to welcome all who come to me. He showed me two paths stretching out from where we stood. One was wide and crowded with souls walking confidently toward what appeared to be light, but as they drew closer, the light faded into darkness. The other path was narrow and less traveled, but it glowed with authentic divine radiance that never dimmed. So many are walking the wide path, Jesus explained, believing they are following the right way to God. They practice religion. They perform good deeds. They follow the teachings of various prophets, but they do not know me personally. They seek God through their efforts, but I am God seeking them through my love. The magnitude of this truth overwhelmed me completely. All my life I had been walking the wide path, trying to reach God through Islamic devotion and good works, but Jesus was revealing that God had been reaching towards me all along, offering a relationship that I could never earn but could simply receive. Looking into his eyes, I understood that this was the love I had been seeking through years of grief and religious striving. This was the peace that had eluded me despite my increased prayers and Quranic study. This was the hope I needed for my children's future and my own eternal destiny. I believe, I whispered, surrendering everything I had thought I knew about God and salvation. I believe you are the Son of God, and I want to know you personally, not just religiously. As the overwhelming reality of Jesus' love continued to wash over me, I felt a peace and joy that made me never want to leave this place of perfect acceptance and divine presence. The paradise I was experiencing, this freedom from all the grief and spiritual emptiness I had carried since Omar's death, was everything my soul had been seeking without even knowing it. I wanted nothing more than to remain in this realm forever, basking in the presence of love that asked nothing of me except to receive it. But Jesus looked at me with an expression that mixed infinite compassion with gentle determination. His scarred hands reached toward my face, and I felt power flowing into me that was unlike any earthly sensation I had ever known as a mother or wife. It was as if divine energy itself was being transferred into my spiritual being, filling me with strength and purpose that I recognized came directly from heaven. "It is not yet your time, Amina," he said with authority that shook the foundations of eternity. "Go and tell them what you have seen. You have important work to do, and I am sending you back to complete it." The joy I had been feeling suddenly mixed with deep concern as I realized what he was telling me. The paradise I was experiencing, this perfect love and acceptance, this freedom from all the pain and confusion of earthly existence, was about to be taken away. "But Lord," I pleaded, my voice heavy with the weight of leaving such perfect peace, "I don't want to go back to that world of violence and grief. Here there is no suffering, no questions about your love, no struggle to understand your will. How can I return to Syria, where speaking your name could mean persecution or death?" Jesus placed both of his hands over my heart, and I felt an even more intense surge of divine energy flowing through my entire being. It was like lightning and warmth combining within my soul, filling me with supernatural strength that I knew would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Tell them that I am alive and I love them," he said with unwavering love and determination. "Tell Muslim women that I understand their grief and loneliness, that I am not just a prophet, but the Son of God who died for their sins. Tell Christians about my heart for Syrian people, how much the Father loves those who have been worshipping Him through Islam, even with incomplete understanding. The mission He was giving me suddenly became crystal clear, and I understood the enormous cost it would involve. To return to Aleppo and tell other Muslims that I had encountered Jesus personally, that He was indeed the Son of God, that salvation came through Him alone rather than through Islamic observance, would mean losing everything that remained of my place in Syrian society. "My children will be taken from me," I said, my heart breaking at the thought of losing Yasmin and Hassan after they had already lost their father. "The authorities will say I'm mentally unstable from trauma and grief. My family will disown me completely. How can I risk making my children orphans when they've already suffered so much?" Jesus nodded with understanding. That showed he knew exactly what this obedience would require of me. "The price will be high, Amina. Your family may reject you and question your sanity. Some in your community will view your conversion as betrayal of everything they hold sacred. You may face persecution from religious authorities who see your testimony as dangerous to Islamic faith. The thought of losing my children, my family's support, and my place in the Syrian Muslim community filled me with anguish that was almost unbearable. As a widow, I depended entirely on the goodwill of extended family and mosque community for survival. To alienate them with claims about encountering Jesus would seem like the height of foolishness to anyone who knew me. But you will gain something far more valuable than what you lose, Jesus continued, reading the struggle that was raging in my heart. You will have the absolute certainty of eternal life with me, and you will have the joy of helping others find the truth that sets them free. Some will reject your testimony and persecute you for it, but others will recognize my voice speaking through your words. Their salvation will bring you more happiness than any earthly security could provide. He gestured around us at the realm of perfect light and love that surrounded us. This is not just your destination, Amina. This is the destination I desire for every person you will meet when you return to earth. Every Muslim widow questioning why God allowed her suffering. Every mother struggling to raise children alone. Every person searching for truth in a world full of religious confusion and violence. I want them all to know that my love is stronger than their grief, and my peace is available to their hearts. As Jesus continued speaking, I felt my resistance to his mission gradually dissolving. The love I had experienced in his presence was too overwhelming and transformative to keep to myself. If there were others who could discover this same peace, the same acceptance, the same freedom from the burden of trying to earn God's approval through religious performance, how could I remain silent about it? I will give you supernatural strength for what is coming, Jesus promised, his voice filling me with confidence that transcended my human fears. When your family rejects you and questions your mental state, I will comfort you with my presence. When community leaders threaten you for abandoning Islam, I will provide protection and new relationships with people who become your spiritual family. When you face financial hardship because of your testimony, I will open doors for provision. And when you feel afraid or discouraged by the opposition you face, you will remember this moment and know that I am with you always. He paused and looked directly into my eyes. Your children will not be abandoned, Amina. I will watch over Yasmin and Hassan, and I will use your testimony to show them the same truth that you have discovered. They will see the transformation in your life, and in time, they too will come to know me personally. The light around Jesus began to intensify until it became almost blinding in its brilliance. I felt myself being pulled backward, away from his physical presence, away from the paradise I had briefly glimpsed. The sensation was like being caught in a powerful current that I could not resist, drawing me back through the spiritual realm toward the physical world I had left behind. Remember everything you have seen and experienced here, Jesus called to me as the distance between us increased. Remember my love for you, and share that love with everyone who will listen. Tell them that paradise is not a place they can earn through good deeds, but a person they can know through relationship. Tell them that I died for every Syrian, every Muslim, every widow and mother who has ever lived, and that my arms are open to welcome anyone who comes to me. The journey back seemed to happen both instantaneously and over an eternity. I was rushing through dimensions of existence that human language cannot adequately describe, carrying with me the memory of divine love that remained crystal clear in every detail. The encounter with Jesus, his teachings about salvation by grace rather than religious works, the understanding of his true identity as the Son of God, none of it faded like a dream or hallucination would have. Instead, these experiences felt more real and substantial than any earthly memory I possessed. As I approached the boundary between the spiritual and physical realms, I could sense my consciousness preparing to re-enter the damaged body that was lying in Al-Madina marketplace. Then, with a violence that shocked every system in my being, I slammed back into my physical form. The transition from the glory and perfection of heaven to the limitations and pain of damaged flesh was jarring beyond description. My eyes flew open, and I gasped for air with a sound so loud and desperate that it startled the paramedic who had been preparing to cover my body with a sheet. "She's alive!" he shouted to his partner, who immediately began checking my vital signs with an expression of complete bewilderment. "This is impossible. She had no pulse for 12 minutes. There should be irreversible brain damage, but her responses are completely normal." As they worked to stabilize my condition and prepare me for transport to the hospital, I remained silent about what I had experienced, knowing that no medical professional would believe such an incredible account. But the memory of my encounter with Jesus burned in my heart more intensely than the bullet wound in my chest, and I knew that my life as a traditional Muslim widow was over forever. The first thing I saw clearly as the ambulance rushed through Aleppo's damaged streets was my mother in law holding Yasmin and Hassan, all three of them crying with relief that I had somehow survived. But I carried within me the knowledge that while their mother had returned to them physically, spiritually, I had been forever transformed by 12 minutes in eternity. The medical team kept me in Al Razi Hospital in Aleppo for 10 days, marveling at my recovery rate and struggling to explain how someone with such a severe chest wound could not only survive, but heal at an unprecedented pace. The doctors expected complications from the bullet wound, potential infection, and possible heart damage. Yet my body was regenerating tissue and healing wounds in ways that defied their medical training and experience. During those long days in the hospital, I spent every quiet moment processing the magnitude of what had happened to me during those 12 minutes of death. The encounter with Jesus remained vivid and unchanged in my memory, more real than the white walls and beeping machines around me. Every detail of our conversation, every moment of overwhelming love I had experienced, every vision of heaven's glory stayed crystal clear in my mind. When my mother in law brought Yasmin and Hassan to visit me each day, I saw in their eyes a mixture of relief, confusion, and growing concern. Their mother had miraculously survived what should have been a fatal injury, but something fundamental had changed about me that even my young children could sense. Yasmin, always perceptive beyond her years, asked me repeatedly if I was feeling all right, not just physically, but in my heart. "Mama seems different," I heard her whisper to her grandmother one afternoon when they thought I was sleeping. "She doesn't pray the same way anymore, and she looks sad when the imam comes to visit." She was right, of course. I found myself unable to participate in the Islamic prayers and rituals that had anchored my life for 34 years. When the hospital imam came to pray with patience and offer religious comfort, his words felt empty and meaningless compared to the love I had experienced in Jesus' presence. The Quranic verses that had once brought me some measure of peace now seemed like distant echoes of a truth I had finally encountered face to face. I once thought my devotion would earn me paradise, but paradise is not a place, it's a person, and his name is Jesus. This realization grew stronger each day as I secretly began to research Christianity online, using the hospital's computer when no one was watching. Reading about Jesus in the Bible with my new understanding was like discovering a completely different person than the limited prophet I had been taught to revere in Islam. After 2 weeks of internal struggle, I could no longer keep my transformation hidden from my family. I chose a quiet evening when my mother in law was visiting alone, and I looked into her kind eyes that had supported me through the darkest days after Omar's death. "Mother," I began, my voice trembling with emotion, "I need to tell you what really happened when I died in that marketplace. Something that will be difficult for you to hear, but that I cannot keep hidden any longer." She leaned forward, giving me her complete attention, probably expecting me to describe some detail about the pain or my memories of the shooting. Instead, I told her everything: my death, my journey through spiritual darkness, my encounter with Jesus Christ, his revelation about salvation, and the mission he had given me to share this truth with others. As I spoke, I watched this dear woman's face transform from curiosity to confusion. then to horror and profound grief. When I finished my account, she sat in stunned silence for several minutes, tears flowing down her cheeks as the implications of what I was saying became clear to her. "This cannot be real, my daughter," she whispered through her tears. "You have suffered terrible trauma from the shooting, the blood loss, the shock, the grief from losing Omar. They have affected your mind. Jesus was only a prophet, nothing more. You know this. Omar taught this to you and the children from the Quran." The conversation continued for hours, with my mother in law pleading, arguing, and desperately trying to convince me that I had been deceived by hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation or post traumatic stress. She reminded me of my children's needs, my place in the family and community, and the catastrophic consequences that would follow if word of my conversion spread throughout our neighborhood. But I could not compromise on what I had experienced personally. No amount of theological arguments could erase the memory of standing before Jesus and feeling his perfect love wash over my soul. No medical explanations could diminish the reality of the paradise I had glimpsed or the peace I had found in his presence. Over the following months, as I gradually shared my testimony with trusted relatives and neighbors, our carefully rebuilt life in Aleppo began to unravel again. Religious leaders came to visit me, hoping to convince me that Satan had deceived me during my near death experience. They used every Quranic verse and Islamic teaching they could remember to prove that my testimony contradicted fundamental Muslim doctrine. I listened respectfully to all of them, understanding their concern for my spiritual well being and that of my children. But nothing could change what I had experienced with Jesus personally. The love, acceptance, and peace I had encountered in his presence were more real than any theological argument they could present. The crisis deepened when some community members began questioning whether I was mentally fit to raise Yasmin and Hassan alone. There were whispered conversations about whether the trauma of losing Omar and then nearly dying myself had caused a psychological breakdown that made me dangerous to my own children. The possibility that they might be taken from me and placed with other relatives became frighteningly real. During this difficult period, I secretly connected with an underground network of Syrian Christians through online forums. For the first time, I was able to speak with people who understood both my Islamic background and my encounter with Jesus. They helped me study the Bible more thoroughly and understand the theological implications of my conversion. The moment that changed everything came when I finally prayed, "Jesus, I believe you are the Son of God. Forgive me for not knowing you sooner, and help me follow you despite the cost." The peace that filled my heart at that moment was the same supernatural tranquility I had experienced in his presence during my death, confirming that my encounter had been real and my decision to follow him was right. I would rather die again with Jesus than live one more day without him. This became my conviction as I began carefully sharing my testimony with other women who were struggling with grief, loss, and questions about God's goodness. I started with widows who had lost husbands in the conflict, mothers who were raising children alone, and women who seemed spiritually hungry despite their outward religious observance. Some rejected my testimony immediately, viewing it as dangerous heresy that could corrupt their own faith. Others listened with curiosity but were too afraid of the social consequences to pursue further conversation. But a few women recognized truth in my words and began secretly studying Christianity themselves, eventually coming to their own faith in Jesus. The persecution escalated when religious authorities in our community issued formal warnings about my influence on other women. I was prohibited from attending mosque functions, and other mothers were discouraged from allowing their children to play with Yasmin and Hassan. Our extended family faced pressure to distance themselves from us, and my mother in law was forced to choose between supporting me and protecting her own standing in the community. Despite these challenges, I found supernatural strength exactly as Jesus had promised. When people questioned my mental state, I felt His peace sustaining me. When others threatened to report me to authorities, I experienced His protection. When financial pressures mounted because I lost seamstress customers, unexpected opportunities for work appeared from sources I could never have imagined. Most importantly, I began to see changes in my children that confirmed Jesus' promise to watch over them. Yasmin started asking thoughtful questions about my transformation, observing that I seemed more peaceful despite the opposition we faced. Hassan, still too young to understand the theological implications, simply noted that Mama didn't seem as sad as she had been since Papa died. My testimony has now reached women across Syria and in refugee communities around the world through online networks and personal relationships. Some have come to faith in Jesus themselves, discovering the same peace and hope that I found during those 12 minutes in eternity. Each conversion brings me more joy than any earthly comfort could provide, confirming that the mission Jesus gave me was worth every sacrifice. Look inside your own heart right now. Do you truly know Him, or do you just know about Him? Are you following traditions and religious practices? Or do you have a personal relationship with the God who loves you unconditionally? Don't wait until death to discover who Jesus really is and what He offers to everyone who comes to Him. I was a Muslim widow who died in a shooting, but Jesus showed me the truth. Now I live, not in fear of judgment or uncertainty about the future, but in His love that never fails. Death in violence revealed life in Christ, and His name is Jesus.